I'm Michael Provence. I teach Middle Eastern history at the University of California, San Diego. I recently sat down and had a long chat with Anthony Shadid. Anthony Shadid is a Pulitzer Prize-winning Middle East correspondent for the Washington Post. And he was shortlisted for a Pulitzer Prize connected with his coverage of the 2006 summer war in Beirut. He spends most of his time in Lebanon, and we spoke about his experiences there, his impressions, his reflections on the war over the summer of 2006 and since in Lebanon. We talked for quite a long time and covered many areas of Middle Eastern politics and history and the United States' role in the region. The Lebanon War of 2006, you covered and spent some of your time. How did you manage to get into the south from Beirut, and what sort of things did you see on the way there?
You know, I think that was the real challenge in a way of covering that war was, I mean, in some ways just the logistics of it. How do you get to cities like Sur, or more importantly, Bint Jbeil, and these kind of frontline villages that were so devastated by the Israeli attacks during that war? I think it required, I mean, to be blunt, it required money to be able to pay people to actually take you down. And then once there, you had to find not only a place to stay and work, but also communications. How can you get your story back to your editors? How can you get what you write into the newspaper in the end? And cell phones, of course, worked, but not always. We also had satellite phones, and this is just kind of the day-to-day. Making the journalism work, but it often represents 60–70% of the actual effort involved is just in trying to cover the story itself. That was, the Israeli army was very insistent on not letting us cover the story the way it should have been covered, and I think that just getting to a place like Bint Jbeil, which even today is still pretty much devastated, it's almost destroyed in a way, was not impossible. We made it, but we made it, one day out of how many, more than 4 or 5 weeks, and that you could have spent the entire time in Bint Jbeil, the entire war in Bint Jbeil, and covered the war in a good way. We, of course, weren't able to do that.
Yeah. You said something very interesting just now. You said the Israeli army was very insistent on preventing the free movement of journalists and the coverage of the war. So, I mean, the sort of infrastructure that was destroyed was clearly destroyed in order to limit that sort of movement, and make it impossible to cover. You would say. I mean, how many journalists were down there? How many of your colleagues made it down there?
There were quite a few journalists. It's tough to say, put numbers on it, because there were television journalists in another hotel. Then there were mainly print journalists where I was staying. There were probably a couple dozen of us. And just making those decisions of getting out and I hate to use the word braving the roads, but taking the risks on the roads to get to these places was was a decision you were going over and over in your head several times a day. There was one instance I remember that stands out when we were on the phone with the IDF, with the Israeli military, telling them that we were going to a village. There was a convoy of journalists going to this village, and we were in contact with them every 10–15 minutes. They knew where we were. They obviously knew who we were. We drove along a road that was in full view of the Israeli military. I mean, this is a border road, and it was very exposed in a way. Got to the village, did about an hour of work. We knew we couldn't stay that much longer, and then on our way back, we were still shelled by the Israeli army, and one journalist was slightly wounded. Of course, that pales before everything else that happened in the war, but it does show you that, there's almost I don't know if it would be a policy of harassment or a policy of just, recklessness in dealing with journalists, but there was definitely very concrete steps taken to make the environment very inhospitable to having people witness what was going on in the South.
Bearing witness was something that journalists were having to risk their lives in order to do.
I think it's one of the, journalism is criticized often, and I think very legitimately criticized. I think that, the profession has really failed in a lot of very substantial ways. But that notion of bearing witness, that notion of being there when, for instance, civilians are killed in the war in Iraq, or Lebanese civilians are killed in the Israeli attacks that happened last summer. I think that's one of the things that journalism can do well, and that has to do as part of its mission. It doesn't always do it. It doesn't always do it well. But when it does get it right, I think it is something that is worthwhile.
Yeah. there were reportedly something like 25,000 Americans in Lebanon. You write for the Washington Post, for an American newspaper. The government, the American government, would have had us believe that all the journalists and all the American citizens, private citizens, whatever, in Lebanon were under threat more from the forces of Hizbollah that are in those communities where they provide services and so forth within those communities than the bombardment of the Israeli military. Did you find that to be the case? I mean, did you ever feel that you were threatened by Hezbollah forces? And I wonder if you could say, as a sort of a corollary to that, I wonder if you could say something about the social function that Hezbollah fulfills within those communities.
I think it's a great point to make about the threat that that people faced in Lebanon last summer, and it struck me as a reporter in the villages in southern Lebanon doing the work, how different it was, say, than covering the war in Iraq, for instance. When dealing with the insurgency in Iraq was a very dangerous business. It was something that you'd have to think long and hard about before you wanted to do, before you venture into a place like Anbar, for instance, or you go to Fallujah before the Americans destroyed it. It was such a different landscape, such a different environment in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah knew we were there. They had informers in every village. They were keeping an eye on things. There was no question they knew we were there. But there was never a threat directed toward us in any way whatsoever as journalists in doing what we were doing. In fact, I'll never forget this one, to me, very memorable episode when it was me and a couple of other colleagues. We were in Sur, Tyre, in southern Lebanon, and we went to the Litani River. And the Litani is kind of in some ways the natural border of southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah, the fighters there were resupplying their lines, basically across the river. And it was a kind of a clandestine operation. They were trying to do it very quickly and somewhat haphazardly. They knew we were there, they knew what we were doing, and they let us watch it. And it was just, to me, it was a striking show of sophistication in some ways, that they understood that that coverage in some ways probably would benefit them, but they also had a certain respect for what journalism was supposed to be and what the role that journalism was going to play in any kind of war, or the role that journalists wanted to play in a war. And I was always struck by that. There was obviously, they had self-interest in doing what they did. We also had an interest in watching what we did, and I thought it was a nice convergence and allowed us to do a story that wouldn't have been done otherwise, that I thought was important. I think that goes to what the role of, in some ways, going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but the role that Hezbollah does play in the South. And if I can maybe turn it to a little more personal direction, I'm working on a book right now in southern Lebanon, and I'm living in a village in an area that's pretty well controlled by Hezbollah. And it's always struck me how much the organization has become an organic part of the landscape. And I don't want to lionize them or anything like that. I'm not sure I want to live in a state that's controlled by Hezbollah, but you can't deny the organic role that they play in that landscape in terms of social services, in terms of welfare of the people, in terms of the connection they see themselves as having to the inhabitants of the region that they're working. And it is a deep connection. It's a connection that I think goes toward the community, the Shiite community's notion of itself, decades of disenfranchisement and what Hezbollah represents in terms of empowerment. But I think it also goes toward the day-to-day livelihood of these people and the role that Hezbollah plays in bettering that situation. That's why I think it's so frustrating for journalists sometimes when you deal with the American context and the Americans simply label it as a quote-unquote terrorist organization. When you're in the Lebanese context, you see this organization in its full form and how nuanced and complex, and in some ways ambiguous it actually is.